This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.
Hey, this is Erin with Cornell Studio Supply located in Dayton, Ohio, exclusive distributor of Jen Allen templates and Put a Lid on It t-shirts. We are a proud sponsor of this episode and the Brickyard Network. Find all your pottery and ceramic sculpture needs, including the largest stock of GR pottery forms at cornellstudiosupply.com. At Cornell Studio Supply, we are owned and operated for potters, by potters.
This episode is brought to you by Snow Farm, the New England Craft Program. Are you looking to take your ceramic skills to the next level? Check out the incredible 2 to 5 day workshop offerings at Snow Farm, where world-class ceramic artists lead hands-on immersive workshops in wheel throwing, hand building, surface design, and more. Whether you're just starting or refining your voice in clay, there's a workshop for you. Set in the stunning Berkshire Hills of Western Massachusetts, this residential craft school is the perfect place to create, connect, and get inspired. To register for a workshop today, visit snowfarm.org. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 549 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I sit down with Nancy Servis, who is a curator, historian, and writer who has spent decades shining light on California and the clay artists that work there. In our interview, we talk about the value of regional galleries in educating the public, artists she thinks need more attention in California clay history like Sargent Johnson, and her experience curating this year's 80th Scripps College Ceramic National. If you'd like to see some of the articles she's written, you can check that out at servisarts.com. Before we get to this interview, I wanted to mention that I've got a few spots left in my surface design workshop that will be happening at Snow Farm. That's up in Massachusetts, and it'll be happening August the 14th through the 17th. If you'd like to register, check the link in the show notes or visit snowfarm.org. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Let's start talking about how you came from studying the history of painting or contemporary painting into ceramics. What was your transition into the clay world?
It was a big life transition. I was in graduate school in New York City, and I had 2 things to finish, my thesis and my foreign language exam. And I was on track to get my degree in early 20th century American modernist painting, which I loved, and which was very alive in that area. One of the reasons I chose that as a field. But when we moved from New York to Benicia, and I had to finish my thesis, so I jumped into a California topic and got that done. But I lived in Benicia, which is where Robert Arneson lived. In fact, I lived 2 blocks away from him. And so that started my education of ceramics in California. And he was a real, I would say, heart and soul of Benicia artistically. I actually didn't meet him because I was a new mother, pretty busy, overwhelmed, moved across the country. But I started to understand a little bit about how clay is being used artistically here, where I hadn't seen it being used in other places. And so that started the awareness campaign, so to speak. And I would walk by his studio just about every day, and his sculptures were around town, and some of his drawings were in various restaurants and things like that. So then we moved to Davis, and that was because the Loma Prieta earthquake of 1989 closed the hospital where my husband was working. So we moved to Davis, and that's where I started to really get my feet wet, so to speak, in clay, because of the clay conference there, because of UC Davis. And it was a real eye-opening experience for me. I would go over to someone's home, and I'd be looking at all the ceramic pieces, which didn't really happen when I was living in New York or where I grew up in Ohio. So that was I'd say, significant orientation I had. I became the director of this very small little gallery called the Pence Gallery, and participated in that clay conference every year, and then started to develop a sensibility about ceramic art, and was invited to then teach at California College of the Arts and Crafts, where I taught for 7 years. And I think what was interesting for me, and for many people, is that I wasn't raised under the umbrella of California clay. I came with a different perspective, and it seemed to get traction. I appreciated so much of what was being done, but I had lots of questions, and I saw things a little bit differently. And so that really helped to formalize my work as a ceramic historian and writer. It all started there. And so from there, I curated many, many shows. I participated in the clay conference. I spoke a few times, and it just kept building from that point.
For people that don't know Davis and the conference that's there and the school, can you just describe what kind of that orbit is? Because I feel like that's a specific California clay orbit is around Davis.
Well, I think that's a really good description, yes. So the University of California, Davis, the University of California has several different locations, and one is in Davis, and it was founded primarily as an agricultural school. But then in the 1960s, it was developing an art department, and it hired many of the leading artists of the day, Wayne Thiebaud being one of them. And Robert Arneson was hired to be the teacher there. And so it's a very flat, kind of open area and somewhat integrated. The university itself is a hub, but the area of Davis kind of surrounds it. And Davis also prides itself on being a bicycle-friendly city. And so you're constantly riding your bike through town, through the campus, that kind of thing. So because this very vital and lively art department developed, then there were some galleries that started to develop around that. And the Natsoulis Gallery was one of those. And it's my understanding that John Natsoulis and Robert Arneson were the ones who developed that clay conference. And it was originally figuration because that's what Arneson was doing. So that brought a lot of attention, I think, to Davis. And the Pence Gallery, which is the gallery that I was the director of and then created a whole new building, that was part of that. And there were a couple other, like the Davis Art Center and then the Artery. So there's this community of art organizations. And it was pretty interesting to see how the Davis community itself really supported that. I think that was unusual.
Well, I want to take a little tangent, and then we're going to come back to California clay. In your career, you were early on, you were a curatorial fellow at the Guggenheim. Yep. Then you ran the Pence Gallery. You were the executive director of the Richmond Arts Center. So you've curated and been in administrative roles in big facilities or like prestige facilities like the Guggenheim, but then also very small facilities. So as a curator, what do you think the value of the underdog, the little space, the small budget art center, what do you think that can do that some place like the Guggenheim or even the Crocker, the big established museums, can't do?
I love that perception. So when I was living in New York, I was living in Westchester and working in New York City and going to graduate school there. And one of the things that I did with my husband is we would drive to the local art venue, whether it was an art center, a little art gallery. I lived very close to SUNY Purchase. And that was a transformative practice because many of those places had real jewels of artwork. They weren't necessarily the big masterpiece that you might see, at the Whitney or whatever. Beautiful little, paintings by Marston Hartley or, some of the landscape painters of New England. And that was very inspiring to me. Because I think working at these big places is wonderful. It's really hard. There aren't that many positions. And I really valued being at the Guggenheim as the Hilla Rebay Curatorial Fellow. And that her identity took on much more importance to me as I researched her life. So that was a guiding principle in my taking the Pence Gallery job and developing. I don't know if you've been there at all, but when I took on the role as director at the Pence Gallery, it was a portable building, as many buildings are in California. And it was a dentist office originally, and the dentist, Joe Pence, gave the building to the city to be used as an art venue. And because I had had those experiences on the East Coast, going to see a John Marin show or whatever, learning about artists in a way that wasn't expensive, but still great. So that was, I would say, a seed of motivation for me to thread that experience into whatever I do. The other component to that, and I've come to appreciate that, I'd say in the last couple of years, is there's a little more flexibility. You're not entrenched in something where you play a very small role. You have a little more latitude, although funding is always a challenge. But I pursued the idea of narrative there, not only showing the artwork, but telling the stories of the people behind the artwork. And that has really taken hold in my work as a researcher. I consider myself as an academic. I've done a lot of research, a lot of writing, but I'm also a storyteller. And I like to find what's behind these things. And that started also with one of my good friends, John Toki. When I was the director at the Pence Gallery, one of the first things I did is I drove down to Berkeley to visit him at Leslie Ceramics. And I walk in, my first time there, I walk in and I'm thinking, I'm going to a ceramic store where they're going to be selling glazes and clay and books and things like that. I walk in there and there's art everywhere, ceramic art everywhere. And again, I'm fairly new to California. And so, well, John, what's the story with all these pieces of art around? And so that was really, I think, an eye-opening experience for me. I got to know John, his family, how the role of the Toki family, their role supporting artists in the Bay Area during the 60s and 70s and 80s. There's some nuggets of information and narrative there that has helped to guide what I do now.
A lot of what I learn is from people like you that are focusing on an artist, doing an exhibition, then writing an essay or sometimes a full catalog about the work. So in my career, like turning to writing like yours has been essential. What do you think is the audience for most of the catalogs, the essays, the writing component of your career?
I've thought about that quite a bit, largely because what is the role of writing this day and age, right? What is the role of history this day and age? That's why I think artful storytelling is really important. So I've been working on a project for almost 10 years now, finishing a book on the history of Northern California ceramics. And I have to always think, who is my audience? Who is my audience? And I want to be able to make contributions factually and aesthetically, but I also want to make it something that's comfortable to read, not off-putting. And so that's a real art. And so I hope when I drafted my audience profile, I thought about all these stakeholders per se: students, aficionados, artists, curators. I think I wanted to provide something of value to all of them, but I didn't want to pinhole myself into something that was overly academic. We've all read those, where they're just basically, here's a catalog that's really written for other curators, not the public. And I think that also comes with being an educator too. Having worked at UC Davis, having worked at CCA, also known as CCAC, I know that education is a pathway. So that has, I think, been my approach, is to try to make it accessible, reliable, interesting, and maybe even a little poetic.
Yeah, and being able to grab the reader and keep them there to get the bigger picture. Because as I was preparing for this interview, I keep thinking about your role as filling in small details of people's lives, like the work that you've done around John Tokey's work about his art and life. You're giving, in the essays, actual, as you said, facts, but you're also giving context. And I think that's what a curator does in the gallery, and a good writer does that on the page. But I think it can be hard when you're a teacher teaching college students, for instance, at CCA or Davis, to keep them actually engaged so that not only they take the course, but that they leave there thinking this was important. You know what I mean?
Well, one of the things I did when I was teaching at CCA, I created a course called A Century of Northern California Ceramics, and that was a gift to be able to do that. The benefit to that was I could take my students to the studios of some of the people we were studying. Stephen DeStabler, Jim Melchert, Robert Brady. We would go, I'd take my students there. And so that brought it alive for them and for me and for the artists. And Stephen got back to me and he said, your students ask such great questions, which I was very proud about. Yes, I think that is the key to make it alive. You know, when people hear the word history, they kind of tune out. I think that's a mistake, as we can apply that to many things this day and age. But I've seen that in the art world in a way that is unfortunate. So I've seen the work of some contemporary artists who are being lauded by so many people doing this, great work. And I'm thinking, this was done 40 years ago, and it's derivative, and history matters. But from my perspective, it's not only history, but it is context. It is that storytelling. So when I write about the history of ceramics pre-1950, I'm not only talking about artists, but I'm talking about those people who were working with artists to show their work, because they had a vision. And that really helped to pave the way for people down the road.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com. can we talk about a century of California clay? Because I don't know hardly anything before 1950.
Right.
So can you give me just like a brief overview of the early 1900s? What was even happening? Because I don't even know enough to know where the hot spots were.
Well, you're not alone in that. That's good to hear because I have an audience. So California is made up of clay. There are clay pits everywhere. So that is one of the things that I think influenced why people came and why they stayed. It's also the climate. It's great climate. Up in Tahoe, where we are, it's a little cold in the wintertime, but I love that. But anyway, there's a lot of clay pits. There's a Mediterranean climate. There were things like the gold rush that brought 300,000 people from all over the world to California. In 1875-ish, there were some men kind of traveling around Northern California, and they were going on a road, and they look, and this road cut had lots of clay. And they're putting two and two together. California is a popular place to live. Here's all this clay. Let's start a clay business that's going to make terracotta sewer pipes for the cities of San Francisco, Sacramento, LA, Gladding, McBean. And there were other industrial clay sites. So that is the beginning, I think, of kind of this big use of clay. There were some small potteries here and there. The other thing that's very important to keep in mind are the role of World's Fairs. So in 1915 was the Panama Pacific International Exposition. And that was a real victory because that was right at the beginning of World War I, and they were still able to have this fair, which brought a lot of international folks to the area. And it's also, the terrible 1906 earthquake and fire demolished San Francisco. And so this World's Fair was very important to opening up California again. And then you have the 1939-40 Golden Gate International Exposition. And so these World's Fairs are cultural venues, in addition to many other things. And so ceramics from all over, not all over the world, but from many parts of the world were there in San Francisco. Someone like Sergeant Johnson, who came from the East Coast to California, he came in 1915. So these World Fairs brought art, and they also brought people. And there's a wonderful, wonderful photograph of a young Robert Arneson, perhaps 9, 10, 11, walking to the Golden Gate International Exposition. So these were cultural guideposts, I would say, to that era. And California also wanted to become a great art entity. These people who came out to the West were coming for lots of different reasons, and they were wayfinding themselves in the art community. And so between having natural resources and these World's Fairs, some of the early potteries of California, Northern California, developed during this time. And we go from potteries to architectural terracotta, which was very important to California because of the memory of the fire from that 1906 earthquake. So you've got architectural terracotta, then you've got people who are coming to California because they're hearing about it. California has this reputation of being a Valhalla, heaven on earth, a bounty of food. Who wouldn't want to live there? Some of that's true, but a lot of it isn't. I mean, it is beautiful, and it is great cuisine, all that. So there's lots of reasons why people are coming to California, and when many people from China were coming, they were bringing their traditions with them in terms of their own rice bowls and things like that, because they were itinerant workers. So there's a massive influx of cultures from both overland and around the Horn, so to speak, and across with the railroad. That multiculturalism is very important to why I think California, Northern California, has such diversity of contemporary ceramic expression.
When we think about that sort of post-World War I up to World War II era, were there any individual artists that you can think of that now are museum collectible? Because I think of companies, but I don't think of people.
Well, one person who I don't think has really gotten the coverage that they deserve, well, there are two. I mentioned Sergeant Johnson, and he's starting to get a little more profile, but he's a really interesting person, and I've always thought he made a great contribution without much acknowledgement. He came from kind of the Harlem Renaissance identity and has a very interesting family history. His one of his parents was Swedish. He has Native American in him, and he's also African American. Really fascinating guy. And he came to California in 1915 and came to Berkeley and worked at some of these potteries and was doing figurative sculpture of his neighbors and friends. And he did beautiful, we call them enamel paintings, just gorgeous. And then he also did some fabulous sculptures, contemporary sculptures. And he was one of the artists who spoke about how he benefited from the WPA. And when you go down into San Francisco to the Maritime Museum, there's an outdoor mural that he did. So he touched on all of these different types of ceramic usage. He did small figuration, he did tile or architectural work, and then he did some other types of more modern, mid-century modern type pieces. The other person I think who hasn't received the attention he deserves is Antonio Prieto. And he was originally from Spain, came to California, sailed to California, and then became this great ambassador to fine art pottery in the 50s. He and Marguerite Veldenhain were two people who were I call that era kind of the era of ambassadorship.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Marguerite Wildenhain because Pond Farm was a ceramic-specific educational experience that people could have. You know, like she had students coming in. They've relaunched that. That's now a residency again where people can work, which is great. But when I think about World War II, one of the things that happened is that you had veterans coming back and they had money. Like the GI Bill was kind of a shot in the arm for the arts in America, but specifically in California as well. What do you think the impact of that? Because essentially it was federal funding for the arts through the veterans. So can you talk a little bit more about like how that supercharged us going forward?
Well, that era is such a poignant time because of World War II, right? Because we have these artists, Peter Voulkos being kind of the prime example, coming back and getting funding from the GI Bill, but we also have these artists like Marguerite Veldenhain and other artists from Europe who are coming to California. So there's many things that are happening there. And an interesting nugget of information about Pond Farm is that there was an attempt to really make it more like a Black Mountain College at first, to have other things. They are not ceramics. But I don't know if you've been to Pond Farm.
I have, yep.
Yeah, it's not just down the road.
Right.
You know, it's you drive all the way out to, the coast. Then you have to drive through the Armstrong Redwoods, which are beautiful. And then you get to a hill, a small mountain, dirt road, and you've got to drive up that to get to Pond Farm. It's about as hard to get to as you can imagine. And so I gained so much respect for Marguerite Veldenhain after I made that homage trip to see where she worked and to not only live there. She had a garden, she had studios, she had all the, kilns. Wow, really remarkable. So I think that much like how the gold rush really changed California. I think this World War II and the WPA and the GI Bill really was a very influential cultural shift that fortunately brought a lot of creatives to Northern California.
Can you talk about the landscape? Meaning, like, there's Davis, there's that hub. There was a lot going on in the Bay Area. There was like an LA contingent down there with schools and people taking classes. But those are far apart. People that haven't been to California, you think San Francisco and LA might be close, but they're not close. So can you talk about kind of the hubs, if there are other hubs that I'm not mentioning?
California is a big state, and that's why we have a lot of freeways. When I moved to California, Northern California, in 1989, I would drive from Benicia, which is this little town still in the Bay Area. It would be called North Bay, Interstate 80 to Sacramento, and no one was on the road. No one. Now it's, they can't keep up with the traffic. Sacramento is kind of in the center of that narrow waist of California. If you look at the California, you'll see it has an indent. Sacramento is the capital. And Davis is just west of Sacramento. So you have many artists who also live in Sacramento, and you've got art entities and things like that. But there is some geographical barricade there. There's the Central Valley, which can often flood, which is okay. So there's a causeway that goes from Davis to Sacramento, which often isn't over water, but it often is too. So that's about a 15-minute car ride. So they're kind of like siblings. And then if you head further west and you leave the Central Valley, the flatness of the Central Valley, and you go through some what's called the Berryessa Range, you then kind of descend down into the proper Bay Area, where you have San Francisco and Oakland and Berkeley and Richmond and all these other little communities around there. And that's a very beautiful dynamic. It's often 20 to 30 degrees cooler environment. That when I lived in Davis, it could be 100 degrees, literally, and then I drive to Berkeley and it's 70.
I think just like, what are the core things artists need? They need a place to work. They need a community to eventually sell the work to. And they also need people around them to be intellectually engaged with. So each of those pockets, like the Bay Area, Davis, Sacramento, and then, down south, there were core groups of people that were together. Some of those groups have now become really famous. So like the funk art movement and Arneson and that gang, like people know about. But are there any groups or communities that you feel like in your research that people just need to know, like, oh, actually in this town people were doing this?
Well, that was an intentional process for me, because I found that not all of the great change makers were always affiliated with a college or university. And there are a couple reasons why that is. Marguerite Wildenhain, for example, taught at CCAC for maybe 2 years, and no, she was done with that. She just was going to go do her own thing. And of course, Edith Heath, but she taught at CCAC as well, was the chairperson of the ceramics department. So I have actually found that it's important to not be only focused on what comes out of universities and colleges, because there's a lot more going on. And one of the artists who I love his work a lot, and he's kind of an important person to the spirit of my research, is Harrison McIntosh, who was born in Vallejo, which is right next to Benicia, which is my area of interest. And then he went down to Scripps, that whole area down in Claremont, Southern California, and developed beautiful vessel work there. And in talking with his daughter a couple months ago, she told me that he told her one of the best experiences and most influential experiences he had was attending a workshop at Pond Farm. So that speaks to, I guess I'm kind of breaking down some barriers. And I often felt when I was teaching at CCAC that there were these holes, and someone like Harrison McIntosh or McIntosh, I've heard him pronounced both ways, are really important. He did end up teaching down in the university system in Southern California, but so many women in particular they were chair people of their departments in the 50s. And because of the nature of society then, they got married or whatever. And we don't hear that. And I feel that those stories are really important. And someone like Joan Jacquard-Pearson, whose work is just fabulous. I was at the NCCA in Utah, and I had a tour with the curator of the storage facility, and there was this beautiful vase, very modern aesthetic, mid-century modern aesthetic, and she was a friend of Ruth Asawa. And so there are these stories too that are insightful, and they're not well documented, but hopefully my book will contribute to that to some point. I have to be careful because otherwise it's a huge 3-volume tome, which I don't want to do. That's not readable.
I wanted to wrap the interview up just getting your opinion, because you're someone who's met so many different people and done a lot of research. The arts funding in California and nationally is really under fire, and things are getting cut. And I feel like funding for curators to write essays, to put the shows together, that is, even in good times, that's always iffy. Yeah. So I just wanted to hear your opinions or thoughts, just how can the academic or the scholarship part of the arts continue in a time in which funding is under attack?
Well, it's hard. It's always been under attack, but this is perhaps more so. When I started proposing my book and creating an outline and talking to people, I actually did fundraising for my book because I knew, and I didn't want to do something online. I wanted to meet people, talk to them, say, this is what I'm doing, kind of have their support. And it's been good. So I'm very comfortable if I'm not happy with things from a publishing standpoint, but I don't really have the answer. All I know is that being in the arts is hard. And if you're going to be someone who's not affiliated with a larger entity, you have to be creative. And so there are pros and cons. You have the freedom to do what you want to do, but it might be hard to realize it in a financial way. So, I have to say, I just wrapped up being the curator for the 80th Scripps Annual. And that was everything you would want in an experience. They were very supportive of my vision. I worked both in the very well-known Fred Mayer collection at Scripps, and then I borrowed from another collector, a Northern California collector, and creating the story of clay and ceramics. Scripps was, I would say, the best example of how they are willing to support a free thinker. You have to make a proposal and you have to back up your proposal. But they were very supportive, and that is their mission. They are the longest running annual of any place in the country. And so when you think about that, when you think about the role that they played. So my point is, if you can find a place like that, which I think is hard too, but I have to say it was one of the best curatorial experiences I had. There were some complexities to the show and some things that got a little outside of my control, but at the same time, we unveiled some of the most amazing pieces of sculpture from Northern California and Southern California and told the stories. And one of my favorite stories from that is the relationship that Fred Mayer, he was a college professor in mathematics who didn't have a big salary to buy artwork, but he was very instrumental in the life of Jun Kaneko. When Jun Kaneko came to Southern California from Japan, didn't speak English, didn't know anyone, and Fred Mayer took him under his wing, and they forged a really close friendship, which I discussed a little bit in that catalog and in the show. And that is meaningful to me. Those are the stories that I try to find. That enriches my understanding of the Mayer collection. It enriches my understanding of Jun Kaneko's work.
Can you plug your website so that people can get in touch? And there is just so much on your website in terms of essays and all of that. So can you plug that so people can find out more?
Of course. Thank you, Ben, for mentioning that. My website is www.servisarts.com. And my name is spelled S-E-R-V as in Victor, I-S as in Sam. That's how I spell my name. So it's servisarts.com. And yeah, it's I don't have any paywalls. And I'm actually needing to update it because I have more articles now. And one of the things I'm trying to do is to tell this story about Northern California ceramics, not only in the United States, but further afield. Because many countries are aware of, say, the funk movement, but they're not aware of and Volkus. They're not aware of other things. So on my website, you'll see some articles that are in German.
Well, thanks so much. It was good to see you today.
Thank you, Ben. Great being with you.
I'd like to thank Nancy for sitting down for this interview. This was the first one I had done in person in quite a while, and I wanted to thank the University of Nevada at Lake Tahoe for letting us use their facilities. They have a sweet little podcast lab there, so we got to record in their sound booth. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art, Cornell Studio Supply, and Snow Farm. If you or your organization is interested in becoming a sponsor, you can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back in a couple weeks with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.